And welcome to the DA press conference on our preview of the budget announcements that are going to be made later this week. Obviously, this is a very, very important budget. It's obviously going to have to deal with the significant difficulties that South Africa is facing. I think it's important to note that going into the COVID crisis, South Africa's boat was very, very low in the water for a number of reasons, which we will unpack a little bit later.
Hello?
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 Hi, Linda. As always, everybody connected that needs to be connected. I'm going to start again then, if I may. Is everybody ready? Are we ready to go? Great. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our press conference on the budget preview for what is going to be one of the most significant budgets, I think, in modern South African history. And certainly there's much anticipation about what is to come this week when Minister Mboweni makes those announcements. I think it's important to note that South Africa's boat was exceptionally low in the water going into the crisis. We've had around about 6 years of technical recession. We had entered into a full-blown recession and it dipped twice during the course of the last while into a full-blown recession. And obviously COVID is going to have a massive impact on the South African budget and on the economy that was already in great difficulty going into the crisis. But I do just want to spend a little bit of time at the beginning of this conference talking about the president's letter, which he has released, in which he almost makes out that the financial difficulty that we're going to go into was inevitable. Now, inevitably, there would have been some difficulties, but some of these economic difficulties have been self-inflicted wounds through some very ill-considered policy decisions that have been made by government in its handling of this crisis, particularly the way in which the economy was essentially shut down. You can't switch an economy off and then switch it back on again as if it's a light switch. There have been significant implications of that, and we're going to certainly unpack some of that. But there are some questions that need to be asked about why we were so low in the water going into the crisis. Why, too, when South Africa needed a government that was able to respond, as governments around the world have done, with relief packages and being able to roll out assistance, the larder was essentially empty because it had been cleaned out through almost 2 decades of poor policy decisions, as well as rampant corruption and maladministration. And so these significant fundamentals, if they are not addressed, are going to cause even further pain for South Africa. So I want to disabuse the notion that this was an inevitability as a result of COVID. It was not. There were bad choices made going into the crisis that have exacerbated it, and policy choices made by government during the crisis that have deepened and worsened this. And we're going to see and unpack many of what those look like going forward. I do just want to also make the point that now is the opportunity for the president to drive his reform agenda. The president sought the presidency and leadership of his party and of the country on the basis that he was going to be offering significant economic reform of the South African economy to restructure it, to make it work better, to build it a more inclusive economy, and to get South Africa off the high debt, low growth, high unemployment trajectory and onto a new trajectory. Well, almost 2 years down the line, there's very little reform on the table and very little changes that have been made. And as a result, the economy is as we find ourselves going into this important week, in deep, deep crisis. And the pain is going to be felt for many, many years to come as a result of some of the decisions that have been made. I'm joined this morning by our Shadow Minister of Finance, Jordan Hill-Lewis, who will be taking us through the press statement. He is joined also by our Deputy Shadow Minister, Dr. Dion George, as well as by our Head of Policy, Gwenin Gwenya, who has been working on a lot of the documentation and our analysis of what has happened in the economy and what is going to be required to shine the light out of it. I think what South Africans are looking for now is a way out of this mess. And we hope to be able to hold up a beacon to show South Africans that we can fix the economy, that we can get jobs going again, we can open factories again, and we can attract investment. But this has to be based on some fundamental reforms that are going to be required. If we carry on doing things the same way we've done them for the last decade or more, we're going to end up with the same result, which is low growth, high debt, high unemployment. And COVID is going to only aggravate that particular situation. Over to you, Jordan, and the rest of the team. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I really appreciate that introduction and those comments that you made. And colleagues, thank you for joining us this morning. We appreciate your time and value your time. We know there's a lot of things going on. And so we appreciate you making time to join this press conference. I'm going to be going through the press statement, but let me say that the press statement is a very brief summary, 700 or 800 word summary of the document that we're releasing today on a resilient budget. And I'd really encourage you, please, if you have the time later today, to go through the document. The document has got a lot more rich information and detail that one cannot cover in a brief press statement. And so that it is an important piece of reading, and I'd really ask that you do go through that. But on to the press statement this morning. Colleagues, Finance Minister Tito Mboweni must present a budget that builds national resilience and helps South Africa brace for impact. Negligible economic growth and high levels of debt have obliterated South Africa's ability to engage in counter-cyclical measures. In other words, to save in times of plenty and to spend in times of crisis. In short, South Africa has lost resilience. Businesses are vulnerable, families are vulnerable, government is vulnerable. Many people have lost their lives and livelihoods who need not have done so. There is no doubt that the ANC-led government will table this emergency budget on Wednesday with blood on its hands. As a result, South Africa urgently needs a plan to restore resilience. We need a resilience budget. In this dire context, a resilience budget must acknowledge that neither austerity, the sharp reduction in spending on basic services, nor a big expansion in spending is possible now. I'm afraid both of those options are off the table. And as South Africa's economic position becomes more and more serious, the options available to us become more and more limited. The only available option is a very careful deployment of debt to fund the crisis response while still ensuring economic reform that can spur growth and, very importantly, showing a clear path to debt stability. This is how we will measure Minister Mboweni's emergency budget this week. Does it, number one, provide a credible plan for deploying debt and resources efficiently in the medium term to provide crisis relief? And number two, does it put in place measures that will allow us to stabilize debt and avoid wide-scale impoverishment by growing the economy? Ultimately, the question is, does it help South Africa brace for impact, or does it only exacerbate our vulnerability? Achieving economic growth will require wide-ranging economic reform, which includes interventions such as cutting the public sector wage bill and sticking by the cuts to the wage bill that the minister announced in February, selling or shutting down state-owned enterprises that cannot possibly remain viable without state bailouts, including and most obviously the present discussion about the resuscitation of SAA, ending Eskom's monopoly and opening the electricity market to real competition, rejecting investment-killing policies like expropriation without compensation, fiscally impossible policies like NHI, and prescribed assets and the nationalization of the Reserve Bank. It is possible that these reforms will actually further help to reduce the cost of our debt, the amount that we pay in interest every year, by reducing the country's risk profile and the risk that lenders face in giving money to South Africa. We must focus on reducing the cost of our debt, which is both affected by the debt trajectory, hence my comments around debt stabilization above, and by the perceived levels of risk in our economy. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Dion George.
Thanks very much, Jordan, and good morning, everybody. As John said at the introduction, is that our economy was in a very bad shape before the crisis because of the very poor decisions that government have made to now, especially on debt. We know that the government's debt was already starting to increase for reasons other than infrastructure development, etc. And that left us in a very difficult space. Before the crisis, the DA was clear that South Africa needs to manage our debt levels. That objective hasn't changed, although this crisis has necessitated a longer-term view on stabilizing our debt. The minister needs to demonstrate that government is committed to reducing overall debt levels over time by showing a clear path to debt reaching a maximum and then beginning a slow descent. Such a path was not shown in the February main budget, and in leaked presentations from Treasury to NEDLAC ahead of the emergency budget, Treasury does not seem to be able to show such a path now either. According to the Treasury's projections, debt will reach 113.8% of GDP by 2028. And at that point, it will still be growing. Now, this is unacceptable, and it will crowd out much more service delivery to the most vulnerable members of our society than our debt already does now. Government must stick to the 160 billion rand cut in the public sector wage expenditure over the medium term. Minister Mboweni also has to hold the line on any further bailouts to SAA. It would be wrong to prioritize SAA bailouts over funding our response to COVID-19. Perceptions of South Africa's risk can be reduced by one, showing a credible commitment to fiscal discipline. And as we said, there is no indication of this, and that is something we're going to be watching very carefully for. And secondly, focusing on growth spurring economic reform. We know that we have a structural problem. The minister was not clear about what conditions would come with any money from the IMF or the World Bank. Clearly, they will ask for some structural reform, but the DA certainly has an entire package of reform that we intend to propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dion. I'm handing over to Gwen now. Gwen has got a slightly weaker internet connection, so she's not going to put on her video, but over to you, Gwen.
Thanks, Jordan. Ultimately, as Dion has highlighted, the only way to achieve debt stability over time and to reduce the overall debt burden is to restructure our spending and priorities. It is in this vein that we have heard Minister Mboweni as recently calling for zero-based budgeting, which echoes the same concerns the DA has had over the years in calling for comprehensive spending reviews. The trouble is that there are a number of obstacles to conducting such an exercise. In fact, since 2013, Treasury has been conducting performance expenditure reviews on specific projects and programs, and they certainly make for interesting reading. What becomes clear is that to do this exercise comprehensively across government, perhaps even annually, would require not only political will, but the skills to execute such a complex exercise, but most importantly, the data to make the exercise meaningful. It is astonishing how much policymaking and funding occurs in South Africa in a completely data-blind environment. Most of the expenditure reviews conducted so far speak to the lack of data available. For example, the review into provincial road expenditure, the review into social housing, the review into TVETs, so on and so on, all of them cite the lack of data in performing the review exercise. Now, these reports are aging, but the challenges remain the same. Zero-based budgeting requires justifying expenditure at its core, but we cannot justify or review what we cannot even measure. Without clear expression of how to overcome these obstacles, announcing a new approach to determining expenditure will amount to wishful thinking. That is the problem with the implementation and the technical tools. Principally, we propose 3 principles to guide spending priorities. We have to first focus on spending that impacts on growth. In other words, spending must be aligned to interventions which have the most significant multiplier effects. For example, spending on infrastructure and service delivery. We must spend where it contributes to the social net. In other words, for example, it's important to consider that even pre-COVID, there were extremely high levels of poverty in South Africa. Over 50% of the population is chronically poor. But what matters even more is that in addition to that 50%, over 20% of South Africans face a high risk of slipping into poverty, meaning that in reality, actually, over 70% of the South African population lives with poverty as a constant threat. So we must focus on spending that does protect that social floor. And then thirdly, we have to spend where it contributes to efficiency. So spending which enhances government efficiency must be prioritized in areas such as making sure that we keep skilled personnel and also invest in efficiency enhancing technology. This allows us to essentially invest on our execution capabilities as opposed to only focusing on policy intentions. Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you very much, Gwen. In summary, colleagues, I think it's important to say one gets into politics in the hope of seeing social progress over time and lifting people out of poverty over time. One understands that that is not an easy thing to achieve, but you have to make progress slowly by putting one step in front of the other in the right direction. And over years and decades, people are lifted out of poverty if you get that right. But what we are seeing in South Africa today is, in a sense, extremely disheartening and disconcerting, because we really do risk seeing mass impoverishment on a level that is unprecedented in our democratic history, and that is both because of the very vulnerable position that we were in entering this crisis in February. After 10 years, a decade of profligacy and fiscal ill discipline, and as a result of the crisis itself and the lockdown and the terrible impact that has had on the economy. So what we need now is a resilience budget to help South Africa brace for the impact of an economic depression that is coming. Minister Mboweni must show a credible path to debt sustainability, a commitment to lowering the cost of debt, and he has to hold the line on public wages and bailouts. Most importantly, he has to demonstrate a real commitment to sweeping economic reform to get the economy growing. Without this deep reform, a full-blown sovereign debt crisis is all but unavoidable. So that is our preview of Wednesday's emergency budget, ladies and gentlemen. As I said, there is a lot more detail that is not covered in a brief summary press statement. I encourage you to read the document, and we are, of course, happy to answer any of your questions on matters that we have covered and matters that we haven't covered, because they might be covered in the longer document. So thank you very much for attending. Once again, we appreciate that. Questions?
Jordan, I have a question. Xianyan. Question is the following. I'm sure it is in your longer document, but just to save time, what specific steps, where would you cut in order to redistribute to what Gwen called sort of investing in a social net? What would you cut? What would you grow?
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Maybe I can take a couple at a time.
Hi, Jordan. It's Lindsay here from ENCA.
Hi, Lindsay.
How's it? Okay, so Gwen's kind of answered some of the question on the zero-based budgeting. I just wanted to know what your view was on that. But secondly, the $1 billion loan that the Treasury announced that it had received from the NDB over the weekend. What do you make of that? I know Dion has spoken about the IMF and World Bank and what conditions they might attach to it, but what do you make of the NDB's loan, and how should that be spent in your view?
Okay, thanks.
Also, a question from me, Linda.
Okay, Linda, do you mind if we come to you in a second? Let me just
Oh, sure, no problem, no problem.
Thanks, Linda. Lindsay, look, ordinarily we would never celebrate any new debt. That said, the NDB loan of $1 billion was long expected. We've known for some time that the government was trying to access that. And we do not have clarity on what conditionalities are attached to that loan. The noises that we've heard from Treasury, as I'm sure you've heard, is that there are very low conditionalities. I'm not entirely sure that they are as low as they would have us believe. So we are definitely going to be submitting some questions to see exactly what the conditions of that loan, the repayment terms, and any other conditions may be. The loan is specifically set aside for COVID response, but of course that is broad. COVID response could mean the stimulus package. It could mean specific health-related costs, but it is clear that it will be deployed certainly in this financial year to fund the enormous fiscal hole that has blown up as a result of COVID. You know, the tax revenues alone are 285 billion rand down this year. This is covered in the document as well. So just in order to maintain February budget spending, you've got to plug a 285 billion rand hole. That's why we say in our document, this is not a time for deep cuts to basic spending and austerity. In fact, we are scrambling just to maintain spending at the current levels announced in February. And this leads me on to Yanyan's question. Yanyan, you will see that we are taking a different approach in the document this year. We are not proposing any deep cuts to basic services at all. We are saying that the minister has to stick by the cuts that he made in February, the 160 billion in the public wage bill, because all of the metrics become immeasurably worse if those cuts are reversed. And he has to hold the line on totally unaffordable bailouts, like on the resuscitation of SAA. But beyond that, as Gwen has said, he's got to show a genuine commitment to making spending in this time much more efficient so as to deploy as little additional debt as possible, but as much as is necessary to get us to fund the crisis response and to achieve a path of debt stabilization over the medium term. Okay, Linda.
Yes, thank you. I just don't know how you balance the debt stabilization with not proposing any deep cuts. You've got your revenue decline. So obviously, if you're not having deep cuts, you're going to have more debt. But you don't want more debt. So how do you square that circle?
Okay, perhaps that wasn't clear enough. What we are saying, Linda, is that we accept that for the medium term at least, there is going to be an increase in debt. That's unavoidable because of the collapse in revenue that has to be plugged to fund basic services and the additional costs associated with funding the crisis response. There is going to be an upward move in the total amount of debt in the short term. But that doesn't mean that the minister cannot provide a plan for debt stabilization in the medium term. In other words, if you look at the graph that I can pull it up for you quickly, that's in the document, there's a debt curve over the course of the next 5 or 7 years. The Treasury has projected that curve to just continue growing without any slowdown or reversal over the course of those 5 to 7 years. That is unacceptable. So what we're saying is, if you want to bring down the cost of our debt, currently 229 billion rand this year, what you've got to do is you've got to show a credible plan to get debt under control in the medium term, accepting that in the immediate term, because of this crisis and because of the collapse in revenue, there is going to be an increase in debt. There are those funding needs that have to be met. But you have to show a trajectory of control. If you show a trajectory that is out of control, then there will be a huge additional risk premium attached to our country, and the price of our debt will soar. And then the second thing is reducing risk through real reform. If you can demonstrate to the market that you are genuinely committed to reform, the perception of risk attached to your country comes down, and the price of your debt comes down. And therefore, theoretically, you can still have more debt at a lower cost and pay the same, if not less, for that debt. But let's be clear. If you don't do those things and you still grow debt over time, then what happens is you just get an explosion in debt service costs, projected to top out at over 300 billion next year. Very shortly will overtake education as our #1 line item on the entire budget. And then, as John said in his introduction, and I think Dion said as well, you will just have less and less to spend on those basic services. So there has to be a short-term acceptance that the crisis requires funding, but it has to be matched with a real commitment to debt stability in the medium term. I hope that's clear, Linda.
Yes. So your sort of critical criteria for judging the budget will be the existence of a long-term debt stabilization plan.
Exactly right, and a real plan to bring down the risk premium attached to our country, firstly by showing that debt trajectory, and secondly by a real commitment to reform. Okay?
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Linda. I'm glad that you asked that question, because that's the really important nuance from our document this year. So I want everyone to get that. Other questions? I can't see people's hands, I'm afraid, because I'm not the host. So if someone could just tell me, or just say your name.
Jordan, if you don't.
Oh, sorry. Can I just jump in again?
Sure, Lindsay.
Sorry, just following on from what you've just responded to, Linda, what would the DA's proposal be for a debt stabilization plan in the medium to long term?
Okay, I'm going to come to that now. I think Gwen wanted to add something on my answer to Linda.
I suppose it also touches on this question. I just wanted to say that I think it's important also that the idea comes across that providing a debt stabilization plan in the medium term doesn't just mean it's just words. I think there are real actions that can set South Africa onto that debt stabilization trajectory. So, for example, again, I'll just make mention of these performance expenditure reviews that were already underway in previous years. You recognize what an extraordinary, complex, and also time-consuming task these reviews are. So I believe even getting started on widespread on such reviews would signal that we are putting together a plan for stabilizing debt, post the short term. So it's not just about saying that we will conduct comprehensive spending reviews or we will adopt a zero-based budgeting approach. It's clear action now indicating that the mechanisms, the skills, and the data required to conduct such exercises is being marshaled presently so that we are ready to do that. to execute on that plan. So I think that there are some very specific things that can be done to signal that. And of course, as we've already mentioned, sticking to that February cut on public wages, not continuing to fund SOEs. Those are all present actions that signal a commitment to future debt stability. So I just think that's important, that we don't talk about debt stability post-COVID as only something which means that we then delay action for the post-COVID environment. There are actions that can be taken right now to set us on that post-COVID debt stabilization path.
Jordan, and maybe I'd also like to just add there to what Gwen has said, is that we all know that sentiment matters. And all that government needs to do immediately is to make a statement on that and say, well, we are committed to managing our debt over time. That's the first thing. And also we know that the public finances are notoriously a leaky bucket, and we've had enormous amounts of leakage in terms of corruption and other problems, continual bailouts. So if government, and Tito Mboweni has already started speaking about that, but clearly gets muzzled at some point, but he has been saying that there isn't any money to constantly bail out, for example. Now, if that message was clear and it was believed, that would go a long way also towards fixing up the sentiment, because we know that that's where the pricing, the premium price to loans comes from as well. And that actually costs us nothing in the immediate term. Thanks, Joe.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. Just to add to that answer, you'll see we've got a section in the document on the fundamental spending review and really reprioritizing spending away from consumption and bailouts over time towards genuine support for social support programs, essentially for poverty alleviation and healthcare and education, and importantly for growth spurring investment in infrastructure and education. So that is a long-term, well, it's certainly not a short-term, it's at the very minimum a medium-term plan that is going to require an enormous amount of work, as Gwen has set out, to go through every line item in every budget and reprioritize money towards a debt stabilization plan and spending on the principles that we've outlined in our press statements today, namely impact on growth, contribution to the social safety net, and efficiency. So that is those are the principles by which we would achieve debt stabilization in the medium term. I just want to make a point that I think is important to add on to Lindsay's question. There may be others in South Africa saying that the solution to South Africa's economic problems are simple. Let me say that the crisis we face is so complex and is now so deep that there are no simple solutions to this crisis. So be very wary of people promising silver bullet solutions like printing money and if we just do this, all of our problems can go away. It can be solved overnight. Very little in life, in any aspect of life, comes from making such little sacrifice and doing such little work. But certainly those are not solutions for solving South Africa's very, very deep and long built up economic crisis, which has only been exacerbated and in a sense concertinaed by the lockdown crisis.
Hi, Jordan. Can you hear me? Hello?
Babalo, yes, I can hear you.
Hi, thanks. Babalo here from EWN. Just a question on prescribed assets. I know the chairperson of the Appropriations Committee touched on these last week in the National Assembly, supporting, COSATU's, kind of call for these to be an option as far as funding Eskom is concerned. And I know Gwede, the Higher Education Minister, Blade Nzimande, also on Friday, touched on these pension funds, not just, for helping Eskom's debt burdens, but also, in assisting with funding the missing middle. So there seems to be this appetite, for pension funds, these cash flush pension funds. Is that not a solution, perhaps? You were just mentioning solutions now in this complicated situation for Eskom specifically, and to assist in that debt burden that Eskom is sitting with, I think it's sitting at 500 billion almost. Are pension funds out of the questions for you as far as this, budget process is concerned?
Thanks, Babala. That's a great question, very topical and important, obviously. And I'm glad that I made the comments about silver bullet solutions, because that is one of them, I'm afraid. It is not a solution. It is not a sustainable solution. It will be extremely damaging to the interests of millions of people who rely on their pension savings in South Africa. It will be extremely damaging to our international standing as a country that is trustworthy with financial investments, and it will only increase the risk, the perception of risk attached to our debt and to our country globally. And I really just think it's a ethically indefensible thing for government to do, to ask pensioners, or not people who are already pensioners, but people who are saving for their pensions, people like you and I, Babalo, to sacrifice the savings that we make on a monthly basis into our pension funds at some distant point in the future. And that's the key, because people don't think about future consumption, right? They think about current consumption today. So if I ask you to give me 10 Rand out of your pocket today, you'd be much less willing to do it than if I said, well, I'm going to take 10 Rand from you in 20 years' time when you need it for retirement. And that's basically the bargain that COSATU and government is making, that people won't really mind about sacrificing future consumption. But in fact, speak to pensioners who have saved their entire lives, and Dion deals with such pensioners on a daily basis. Speak to pensioners who have saved their entire lives and figure out right at the end that they haven't saved enough to fund their basic needs during retirement. So it is wrong to do that. And as I said, it's another one of these silver bullet solutions. The government, instead of doing the tough things that are required to slowly but surely dig us out of this hole over time, it's much easier to say, well, look, there's this huge pot of other people's money. Let's see how we can figure out a way to use that pot and make it seem acceptable by calling it solidarity, or what COSATU calls, pensioners should be happy with a social return. They literally say this in black and white, a social return, as if that's going to pay the bills when they are retired. And so these pots of money become increasingly attractive and beguiling. And the same goes with printing money. Well, all our problems could go away if we could just do this. I'm afraid that history shows that while there might be short-term palliative measures, they end up compounding problems in the long term because they sap confidence so much. And just as a final point, Babalo, I would say, if there is any worthwhile project in South Africa that requires investment from pension funds, that is well governed, that is transparent, and that delivers decent returns, they will never struggle to attract capital. There's no shortage of capital in the pension fund market. We know that, right? South Africa has one of the highest pension fund savings in the world. But the problem here is not that pension funds refuse to invest in Eskom. If Eskom was well run and delivering decent returns, there would be a flood of investment in Eskom. The problem is Eskom. It's the governance and the government that runs it.
Jordan, if I may,
yeah,
quickly, is just to say that I think we also need to be very careful to ensure against rhetoric that basically allows the government to extract double its pound of flesh. Many South Africans do stand in solidarity. They do invest in a social return, or they do invest in in projects that will make a social difference. That's what taxation is for. That is precisely why we pay taxes. Some of the money we pay in taxes, you will never directly get back in return, but it's an investment in the society that you live in. So let's not now use the same argument for why taxes exist in the first place to demand that further resources be extracted from South African citizens via an alternative avenue. We already are paying a social solidarity.
Jordan, also to add to what you and Gwen have said is that, instead of government asking how it can tap people's pension money that's intended to grow until they retire and provide for them, then the government should be asking how it could help people then to harness that saving they already have. So, for example, we now have a situation where many people are in a very, very difficult situation, and they do have monies in their pension funds. There's absolutely no reason why people should not be allowed to take a pension-backed loan from their pension fund, as they are allowed to now with a home loan. Why can't they utilize the pension money they have available as a backing for a loan that they get from the bank, like they do with home loans? We have proposed a private member's bill to amend the Pension Funds Act to allow for that. So instead of government asking to take the money away to invest in ways that will not deliver returns, it should rather be saying, how can I help you now in this situation at a micro level and leverage your pension to help you during this difficult time? Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Any other questions? I'm afraid I can't see hands. If someone from the staff team could just let me know if
there are none, Jordan, as far as I can see.
There are no more hands.
Okay, great. All right, well, I really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you for attending our press conference. Thank you, John and Dion and Gwen.
And also notice Dennis Ryder was here as well from the NCOP. He was also
great.
present as well.
So that's it from me, John. I don't know if you want to close off, but thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to our finance team for the presentation. I hope that you'll engage with the document. It sets out in much broader detail, in much greater detail, the broad brushstrokes which we've been able to provide today. But it's very, very clear that the economics and politics of the economy are going to be very, very important going forward. The president has often described South Africa as in a post-war situation. Well, now we need to see the big guns coming out, and those big guns can only be reforms. So we look forward to seeing what the minister has to say this week, but whichever way he goes, it's going to have profound consequences for the future of the country's economy and for the people of the country as well. Thanks very much, everybody, for making time. We'll see you in Parliament.